So, you want to learn servers. You've come to the right place. This is getting started with how to build a server. So, you can see some hardware in front of me that we're going to use as examples and talk about. We'll go into that a little bit later. So, you want to build a server for whatever reason. Maybe it's to learn with. Maybe it's to actually utilize, like a file server, for example. Maybe you want to host game servers at a LAN party or for your friends. Or maybe you want to create a virtual machine host. Or maybe you want to learn things at the enterprise level. You know, the possibilities are endless with servers. So, where do we get started? The first thing you want to think about is your budget. How much money are you willing to put into server hardware? Because it can get very expensive very quickly, especially with storage and some other things. Especially when it comes to storage and the hardware itself. Depending on what tier of hardware you get. You could get server grade hardware, like seriously high server grade hardware, and get yourself a rack, like 1U and 2U cases, and put your servers in there like it's the real thing almost, and spend a lot of money on that. Or you could do what I would suggest if you're just getting started and just build a server like you would a normal desktop computer with a case, motherboard, power supply, and drives. And keep it simple. If you just want to get started, I think that's the best way to go. It's still what I do for servers to this day. I personally just don't see the point in making a rack full of servers just yet. My needs aren't that high. At least at home they aren't. So that's the first thing you want to think about. How much money do you want to put into this? And you want to keep that in mind throughout the process of selecting all the hardware. I mean, these steps are interchangeable. I mean, think about your money while doing this. The next thing you want to think about is what kind of case you want to put the server in. Whether you want to do a rack mount server or you just want to build it like you would a desktop machine, like I'm suggesting you do if you're just starting out. Here's an example of a desktop machine. It's just your standard desktop case on its side here. It's about a $30 case. And it's just your standard ATX case. You can use something like this that you would build a normal desktop computer in to build your server in, just so long as it has good ventilation on both sides. So make sure there's a fan in the front that cools your drives and a fan in the back that lets air out, that are both a 120 millimeter fan, I would say, because you need some good ventilation for a server. I would suggest, if you're starting out, building it like you would a desktop computer by choosing a motherboard, case, and power supply. And one thing you want to do with servers is to the first thing you want to think about is your storage. The first thing on your mind should be your storage, because that will affect your decision of what case to buy, what power supply to buy, and what motherboard to buy. That affects everything. So think about what your storage needs are first. Do you want a lot of redundancy in your server, if it's a file server, for example, or even if it's a game server, for performance or for data security? Or do you just want to put one drive in there just to learn, just as a test bed to learn how to do server stuff on? Or do you want to do a separate boot drive and a separate data drive? These are things you have to think about. Personally, I like redundancy, so that's what I've chosen with these 4 drives here. So with that in mind, I have 4 drives in this system. 2 of them are server grade, 2 of them are desktop hard drives. So if you have drives like I'd have lying around, you can mix it up, it's fine. For a home server, that's not a big deal, as long as the drives are functional and they work. So with that in mind, I've had the 4 drives here, so I need at least 4 SATA ports on a motherboard. So let's take a look at the hardware we have here. Here's a here's a budget desktop board that's still high quality despite being budget. This is a Gigabyte GA-H61N S2PV, a very rock stable motherboard. It has everything that I would need to run the server on it. It has 4 SATA ports. It has onboard video, so I don't have to put an extra video card in it. and it has a CPU powerful enough to handle a file server. It's a Celeron D530, and 4 gigabytes of RAM. That would be plenty for a file server. Now, let's say that you're going to host game servers or something like that. I would bump the RAM up to about 8 gigs and stick a higher tier CPU in there, such as a Core i3, maybe for game servers, maybe even a Core i5. It really depends on how demanding the servers are. That's something you definitely want to research before, that's something that you're going to want to know about before you buy a server. Ask people that run game servers what the resource requirements are, because you might need some pretty nice hardware to get to handle the load properly. And it also depends on the game that you're hosting too. So this is a more recent example. Now, let's say you have motherboards lying around that you haven't used in years. For example, here's a Pentium 4 system from the early 2000s. It has no SATA ports whatsoever. It's just all IDE stuff. So if you just want to learn, if you want to build something to learn on, this will be a good option, because if you have one of these just sitting in your closet, like an old machine like this came out of an HP from the early 2000s, and the thing works beautifully. So I could use this to learn server stuff on, and it would work beautifully. So if you have that and an IDE drive, you can still learn how to do server stuff on an old machine like this, assuming you have enough RAM. This has about 1 gig of RAM in it, so that's plenty. So you can use old hardware. It's fine. It's not a sin. You can if you need to. It's fine. But if you're going to put any load on the system, I would recommend something newer. Of course, you could have something that's about 2008 technology lying around, like this, for example. The DDR2 system with an AMD chip in it, but has a bunch of SATA ports. Something like this would be really good for redundancy. Let's say you upgraded your desktop from your DDR2 system years ago and still have the motherboard lying around. You could use that to build a server. That way you'd save some money. Or you could do what I tend to like to do and actually buy server-grade hardware. I'm not quite sure this is completely server-grade, but it's made by a company that typically produces very high-quality server-grade hardware, and that is Supermicro. Supermicro is a name you'll hear tossed around a lot with servers. They make server chassis, they make motherboards. I really like their products. I use one of them in my main file server myself. It's a Core 2 Duo Socket 775 based Intel motherboard with 4 gigs of RAM in it. It'll do just fine for a file server. So these are the things you want to be thinking about when choosing a file server. You can really use anything you want. You just need to make sure that you think with a solutions mindset and that it meets your needs. That's all it has to do. It doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to meet your needs. Even for a test bed, it should still meet your needs. Like, especially if you want to do a virtual machine host, you want a CPU with quite a bit of cores on it and quite a bit of RAM in that particular system. So, depending on what you're doing with it, you need to think about the resources that you're going to use, and how old hardware you can use for it, and what you're going to buy, etc., etc. In other words, what you're going to do with the server is going to affect what you buy. So keep all that in mind while doing the server. Now, let's come back to hard drives for a second. You want to think about that as well. Now, depending on what drive configuration you want, it's going to affect everything else you buy, like I said before. You got to decide whether you want redundancy or not. You got to decide whether you want a separate boot drive or not, depending on what you're doing with it. For a test bed server, just to mess around, one drive would work fine. If you want to figure out how RAID works, I would suggest buying 4, 5, 6 drives, even like small capacity ones, just to learn on. Let's say you have an old motherboard lying around and you want to learn how to do RAID 6, for example, or RAID 10. You could buy 6 160 gigabyte hard drives and use all those for RAID and not spend a whole lot of money per drive. So that's always a possibility. So the other thing you want to do is not skimp on the power supply. This is an ACBell power supply that was pulled out of a Sun Java workstation. So this was actually made for industrial use. This should be fine. You want to use high quality power supplies in your server. Do not skimp and buy like a Corsair CX430, for example. Those are garbage power supplies. Don't buy a cheap power supply for $50 and put it in here. Buy the $120 Seasonic or something to that effect, because you're going to need a power supply that can handle the load and has decent protection circuitry. And the protection circuitry is the biggest part of this you want to pay attention to. You really want good protection so that your data doesn't get lost, or it doesn't fry a drive or fry a motherboard. In other words, you can't be too careful with a system with your data. You need to take it seriously. So that's what you want to think about when getting started with the hardware. So you want to think about what you're going to do with the system. That determines, the age. That determines the age of what you might buy, or determines the tier of what you might buy, whether it's server grade, enterprise grade, or just plain desktop hardware. You want to think about how many drives you're using and the redundancy, and you also want to think about what kind of a case you want to put it in. And like I said, when you're just getting started, I would just build it like you would a normal desktop, and so that things are familiar and you don't overlook things, and everything's it's a good place to start. So, and while all that's in mind, you want to keep an eye on your budget, and don't be afraid to use older hardware. It is totally fine to do it. That's exactly what I'm doing with this build that we're going to take a look at here with this Supermicro board. This board is from 2010. So it's older hardware. It's socket 775, so it's very, very late socket 775 stuff. It's older hardware. It's not a sin to use that. It just depends on what you're doing with the system. So these are some things you want to keep in mind when beginning to build a server. Now, once you have all that in mind and you have the parts, of course, you want to put the server together as you would a normal PC. So I'm going to do that, and we'll come. One thing I should mention is when selecting a case, one thing I try to look at is convenience, and with hard drive mounting, this particular case has 4 3.5-inch hard drive bays and 3 2.5-inch drive bays, so I could add 7 hard drives to this system in total, which would be pretty nice for storage. You could have 6 drives in redundancy and still have 1 boot drive if you wanted to. These removable hard drive trays are very nice too. So convenience is another thing you want to look at with cases. Toolless design can make maintenance a lot faster and a lot easier, but the drawbacks of toolless designs is that sometimes it's not as secure as using screws. So that's your preference. What case you buy is all on you, but I would suggest buying one that fits your needs and does not have thin metal disease, like a lot of cheap cases do. This was a $30 case, but the metal is still pretty darn tough, and that's pretty nice. That's a rarity. Usually you have to spend more than that to get thicker metal, but I got lucky with this one. So, onward with the show. I need to screw down the motherboard and plug everything in. Okay, I have everything installed in the system. The ACBell is all hooked up. One thing you want to keep in mind with older power supplies like this is sometimes you're going to need adapters. For example, the 8-pin CPU connector on this doesn't split, so I had to convert it to a 4-pin using a little cable here. And the ATX connector was too short, so I had to use a tiny little extension cable to get it over to the top of the motherboard there. So some things you might have to be aware of. You might have to MacGyver a few things together. So there you go. That's the look of a server. Looks like a desktop, doesn't it? That's because it pretty much is. So now that you have all your hardware installed, you're pretty much started. Once you have a build together, you are started. So there you have it. That's the first half of the battle, is choosing the right hardware for what you need. Now, if you're just using one drive, let's say these drives don't exist and you're just using one drive in your system, You're done. You don't have to do anything else, and you can continue to the next part, which is, the software end of things and what you actually want to do with the machine. If you're doing like I do and using redundancy with either 2, 4, or 6 drives, this is a part you want to pay attention to. If you're just using one drive, don't worry about it. You can skip to the next part of the series if you'd like. But for those of you who are doing redundancy, stick around because I'm going to talk about it a little bit. Now, some of you might not know how to do redundancy. If you've ever heard the term RAID array or RAID before, that's redundancy. What a RAID does is it groups hard drives together and uses them in tandem. For example, there are many different types of RAID. There is RAID 0, which is commonly referred to as striping. Now what that does is it uses several disks as one item. So let's say I did a RAID 0 on these 2 disks. It would use these 2 disks as one giant disk, basically. It would act as though it were one giant disk. That is what people use for performance. So if you need serious performance out of, let's say, a video editing cluster or something like that, you'd want to use RAID 0 on a particular desktop machine. I would avoid using RAID 0 in servers because data integrity is very low on RAID 0, because if one drive fails, the entire array is busted. Your data's gone, pretty much. I mean, it probably could be recovered a little bit, but the array is busted pretty much. So RAID 0 is something I would reserve for desktops and not for servers, ever. There is RAID 1, which is commonly referred to as mirroring. And mirroring sounds more straightforward. So RAID 1. RAID 1 is typically done with 2 disks. So let's take these 2 bottom disks here as an example. If you were to RAID 1 these 2 disks together, these are both 1 terabyte drives. So you'd still have 1 terabyte of space with RAID 1. You'd have 1 terabyte of space and 1 terabyte of redundancy. So it literally mirrors the drive. You have an exact copy of your drive on the other drive. That's what RAID 1 does. That's a pretty modest. If you just want to learn how to use RAID, that's a pretty modest setup. So you could just take 2 drives, RAID 1 them together, learn how to configure a RAID, and that's still good enough for learning how to do servers, because applying different types of RAID is largely the same. Applying RAID is largely the same no matter what type of RAID it is. You just have to know what each RAID is for. Now, there is RAID 10, which is RAID 1, which is RAID 0 and 1 at the same time. You need 4 disks for that. That's what I'll be using on this particular setup. It does mirroring and striping, actually. It takes 4 disks and it takes a RAID 1 array. It basically takes a RAID 1 array of 2 disks and stripes it to another array of 2 disks. So it's a pretty even balance. You get redundancy. You get the same amount of redundancy and storage. It's very equalized. So this is 4 1 terabyte drives. You get 2 terabytes of space with a RAID 10. And RAID 10 is pretty secure when you're using Btrfs on Linux, for example. So it really depends on what software you're using, whether you want to use RAID 10 or not. And it also depends on cost. RAID 10 is also more expensive because you have to buy more drives. There are also RAID 5 and 6, which use a parity drive. Now, RAID 5, I believe you can use at least 3 drives to run. It'll use one of the drives for parity. And RAID 5 isn't the most... RAID 5 isn't the most secure thing in the world. I would use RAID 6. If you're going to do that, RAID 6 also uses parity, but I believe it also uses more drives. I'm not too sure about RAID 6. I've never actually used RAID 5 or 6 before. I've never had the need to, so I'm not an expert on it. But those 2 are also available if you prefer to use parity and use less drives in your setup. Personally, I like RAID 1 and 10 the most because they're very easy to set up and they're very straightforward. Especially for what I'm doing with a server, which is, data security, which is nice. So that's another thing you want to think about with the drives. So that's a whole rundown of redundancy. I would start by making a RAID 1 array. That way you don't have to spend a lot of money on storage and you can still learn what a RAID does and how it works and how to set one up easily. Or you could do RAID 10 if you have 4 drives lying around if you wanted to. But personally, I would say start with RAID 1 and work your way up. And then you'll learn how all this RAID stuff works pretty quickly. It's not too hard, actually. It may have a bit of a learning curve if the concepts are foreign to you, but once you get over that learning curve, it's really not that bad. RAID is something you'll be able to do in your sleep after a while. I mean, obviously you might have like a reference next to you on a laptop or something, but you'll still be able to do it fairly easily. So that's a rundown of redundancy, what hardware and the hardware and everything for building a server. This has been a video on getting started with your server. You got to start with the hardware. You got to focus on the hardware, the money, and your needs, and the solutions part of it first. And that's what this video was supposed to outline: is the solutions aspect, the hardware meeting your needs, planning your budget out, mostly due to the drives and the performance, and getting the whole process started. Once you have the hardware all set up, that's half the battle. Once that's done, you're halfway through. The other half is setting up the software side, and that's where part 2 will come in. We will go over that in a future video, but hopefully this was helpful in getting started with building a server. You gotta have the solutions mindset when doing this. So there you have it, folks. I hope this was very helpful and informative to you in first getting started with a server. And stay tuned for part 2, because there will definitely be a part 2 on how to do the software side of things, how to do RAID using various different methods, ButterFS being one of them, maybe MD RAID on Linux being another. It really depends on what you want to do with the server. So we will get to that in future videos. But for now, this was getting started with building a server. You can start with a desktop machine and work your way up, which is personally what I would say is the best course of action if you want to learn this yourself. So there you have it, folks. I hope this was informative and very helpful, and have a good one, everybody. Ciao.